So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our kickoff training event of the year. I'm Dr. Julie Tennille, Associate Professor of Social Work in the MSW program at Westchester University. And since the retirement of the grant author, the passionate and talented Dr. Nadine Bean, I'll be working as Program Director for the fourth and final year of our Health Resources and Services Administration grant, focused on interprofessional education and integrated care. I'd like to express an enormous debt of gratitude to this amazing team behind the scenes that you're seeing here. This includes Dr. Cheryl Neal McFall, co-principal investigator and program evaluator, Wendy Myers, our grant program coordinator, our research assistant, Sarah Fisher, and our graduate assistant, Fatima Bakayoko. We're very excited about our two amazing presenters tonight, and we will introduce them momentarily. Since this is part of a larger study, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the research and guide you through our informed consent and pretest. Also, because of the size of this audience, we will be taking questions for our speakers at the end of the presentation. So please enter your questions in the Q&A box throughout their talks. Fatima Bakayoko will be monitoring for themes to pose to our presenters toward the end of our time together tonight. The goal of this research and training grant is to expand numbers of MSW and MED school counseling professionals working with persons across the lifespan in vulnerable and medically underserved populations who can deliver evidence-based behavioral health services in southeastern Pennsylvania, Camden, New Jersey, and Wilmington, Delaware. Over these last 4 years, in a competitive application process, 116 students in their final practicum year have been awarded unrestricted $10,000 stipends. This funding has enabled some of our students to pay off credit card bills, car loans, or stop working part-time jobs to enable them to focus more concertedly on their education and on absorbing knowledge and skills of working in integrated care as they prepare to enter the workforce. Additionally, these stipend recipient students have been part of an extensive interprofessional training program that includes their field supervisors. They are all attending 4 trainings over the course of this year, engaging in a practicum that adheres to integrated care standards and competencies, and taking a special elective on advanced clinical practice in integrated care. With over 25 affiliation agreements with community health partners, including schools in the region, this project is focused on long-term sustainability via an interprofessional network. To that end, we have an Education and Programming for Integrated Care Regional Advisory Board of stakeholders. This advisory board is comprised of approximately 15 to 20 members from a variety of professions serving the region's medically underserved communities and steered us in the direction of fulfilling the values, mission, and vision of the board. One vision for the future includes working with our foundation and other university stakeholders to create a Westchester University Center for Integrated Care and to continue to hold biannual symposiums. We had a really successful symposium in 2019, and we hope to hold another. Tell you about our amazing presenters for tonight. The first presenter to speak will be Antar Bush. We're very proud of Antar. He's a grad of our MSW program at Westchester and also a grad of our MPH program. Antar is a public health advocate, educator, writer on social justice issues, and owner of Outpour LGBT Productions, a YouTube channel dedicated to Black, queer, pop culture, and social justice. Antar trains and collaborates with nonprofit organizations, medical schools, homeless shelters, and university counseling centers to help them create safe, justice-oriented policies and practices. For over 10 years, Antar's been helping social service agencies build greater capacity in the workplace, and Antar also does consulting on fundraising, organizational leadership, and cultural competency. Outside of the office, Antar loves mentoring other men of color and speaking internationally on topics such as intersectionality, health disparities, dating in the digital age, and the effects of slavery on African Americans today. Antar's belief is that the world is built on the strength of communities. Having this view of the world propelled him to focus on underserved populations, ethnic and cultural minorities, the kinky polyqueer communities, and victims of economic hardship. His signature combination of warmth, humor, I can attest to the humor, and compassion allows people of all backgrounds to improve their relationships and live the lives they desire. Our second presenter is Dr. Jari Santana-Wynn. Jari is an international speaker, certified LGBTQI trainer, and clinical coordinator of outpatient services at Holcomb Behavioral Health Systems in Kennett Square. She earned her Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Miami University of Ohio, where she completed her dissertation on acculturation stress in immigrant children. She has worked in community mental health clinics, hospitals, and school settings. Dr. Santana's own experiences as an Afro-Latinx immigrant child drive her commitment to provide culturally competent mental health services to minority populations and make her a tenacious advocate for the social, health, and educational needs of these communities. She is a founding member of Aspira in Delaware Incorporated, where she currently serves as a parent liaison and chair of the board of directors. So this training tonight seeks to utilize critical race theory to educate behavioral health professionals dedicated to service and justice on ways in which increased understanding of post-traumatic slave syndrome can inform our practices, prepare us for competent and ethical integrated care practice, and position us to lead the efforts toward eliminating inequity in integrated care through direct service, advocacy, policy development, and implementation. At this time, I'd like to invite Antar to unmute himself and to take over the presentation. And I will advance slides at your command, Antar.
Oh, thank you so much. I can't see anyone out there, but know that I'm feeling you in spirit, and I hope that we have a wonderful dialogue today with my portion and with Jari's portion. These topics of post-traumatic slave syndrome is near and dear to my heart, and I will get into a little later on down the line on what triggered this love relationship with this particular theory and framework. So with that said, let's jump right into it. So today, well, this evening, if you're on the East Coast, we are going to peel back the layers of slavery in America, of enslaved people. We are going to explore your own or our own fear, guilt, shame around 246 years of chattel slavery. And it is very easy to become dismissive of well, that happened so long ago, or how does that really affect me, or does it even still affect me? We are going to peel back all of that. But what I don't want is folks feeling guilty, having white guilt, or I just don't want that, because that is unproductive to the purpose of this. We want people to be able to explore what is happening with their discomfort and be able to heal from that. So you may not heal from that within this 40-minute presentation, of course, but this will be the first of many steps to getting there, right? So I often like to start off with James Madison, our fourth president, because I like to, just one, I'm a big history buff, and two, this will really set the framework for everything that we're about to talk about in this portion of the presentation. James Madison, our fourth president, said, regards them, slaves, as inhabitants, but as debased by servitude below the equal level of free inhabitants, which regards the slave as divested of 2/5 of a man. So what does that mean, right? They had to, the reason, this is the famous historical legislation of 2/5 of a man, right? And whenever I see that, I didn't even, as a child, when you're learning about this in school, you couldn't really even process this, right? You can't process this. What does 2/5 of a man really mean? And so as a child, you're continuing to learn this 2/5 of the man, this 2/5 compromise among slavery for the southern states trying to gain power in the legislature, right? But it's almost like, and if you read it in here, they're talking about a product. It's a product they're talking about. They're not actually even talking about a man. They're talking about a product. And the reason why I bring this up is because this is coming from the fourth president of the United States, okay? So fast forward, let's fast forward this. This is being taught generation after generation after generation after generation. So after a while, you start to internalize, are you even a whole human being? Or are you just a product of something? And sometimes it's not that black and white, but just the fact that, first of all, America is a country that values education and that this is in our books. So we really have to explore what is happening here and really digest it. So I always start off with this quote because it really does set the tone for why why we talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome. Because one, it's kind of written in the books not to think of Black people as humans. They are thought of as a product. So, and this was taught, I went to the elementary school in the 90s and this was still being taught. Yeah, we can move on to the next slide. Also, I get very scared when I see people dressed like that for Halloween, because I'm like, that was not a good time for Black people. So Dr. Joy DeGruy is a clinical social worker and clinical psychologist. She really coined this phrase, the post-traumatic slave syndrome, in 2005. This is a theoretical framework that explains current behaviors that exist in the Black community that shows the link between African Americans today and slaves during the slave period. The event of the trauma of slavery has contributed to many behaviors that are existed in African Americans today, and we're going to go over the gamut of them. I'm going to give a lot of examples later on. PTSS is a condition that exists when the population has experienced multi-generation trauma resulting from centuries of experienced oppression and institutional racism. So we are talking about a group of people who have been captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, and experimented on, all with no help. For 246 years, trauma, no help, freed, no help, more trauma. What is that more trauma? Then we get into the lynchings and civil rights movement, all of that other stuff, Jim Crow. So again, there is a system in place, and we're going to talk about all of that later on. So as much as I talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome, I always know in the room, I get these gut level reactions you know, what happened? It happened so long ago. Why can't Black people get over it? I didn't own slaves. Well, I can tell you right now, it really, when I hear this, I often tell people, I want you to imagine me on this webinar, and I take a puppy and I bash that puppy in the head, and I just start bashing it in the head. You would experience some trauma from that. You would experience some serious trauma from that. There was a whole Netflix series on that stuff, right? It was a whole Netflix series on that. Not only would you experience trauma from it, but if you told this story to your partner, to a friend, they may even experience trauma from hearing that story. So I say this to say that even if you don't experience the trauma directly, one can still have all of those same anxieties and triggers, just the same as the person who was directly affected by the trauma. So when people say things like get over it, really what I hear is, I may not know anything about the subject. 2, I don't know how to address it, especially white folks who aren't really versed in cultural competency. So they may shut down. I didn't own slaves is a really popular one. Well, a lot of people didn't own slaves. Only 10% of the South owned slaves. So, but what is it? What is happening here? Again, it's sometimes that lack of empathy, but we're going to talk about not just how post-traumatic slave syndrome affected Black people, because it's very easy to get into that, right? It only affected the Black people. No, we're going to talk about how it affected white people as well, and how it really affected the nation as a whole. So what is the impact of post-traumatic slave syndrome on African Americans today? There are clear connections between the survival behaviors of slavery and contemporary living experiences for African Americans, such as adaptive behavior and survival behavior. How does factoring in being Black in America impact stress levels on the body to operate one's own immune system, right? We are seeing this in real time with COVID happening, with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. And so we are seeing this literally happen in real time. Some clear connections of that, I often like to bring up in my human development class. I often ask my students, especially the Black students, I say, when you were younger, right, and your mom would take you into the bank or the store, what was the first thing she said to you? Don't look at nothing, don't touch nothing, and you better stay by my side. And she didn't play, and you didn't move. You stayed like close to the hip to her, right? And I'd ask my white students, you know, did your parents ever like really give you that speech like that every single time you went into the store? And they would say no. Like I would see, like, and even today, like I see like some white children or other races letting their children kind of explore and be around the store, because that is a natural thing for children to want to have autonomy and explore where they're going in the store or in a bank or wherever, and, you know, kind of linger away from their parents. But Black children don't do that. Black children stay right beside them. And if they move, they're going to get in trouble. And not only that, other Black parents who are in that store will police those children as well. But what is happening? Well, I'm going to rewind. Let's take this back 300 years, right? So you're on we have Black people on a slave plantation, and the mother has to keep that child with her, because if not, maybe one of the owners will then sell the offspring. Or maybe she has to degrade the child because she doesn't want the child to then be sold to another plantation. So she's constantly keeping an eye, and she's growing an insecure attachment to the child because she doesn't even know if the child is going to be sold. And so when you start to unpack that generation after generation after generation, it looks like, don't go into the store and don't move next to me. Don't move away from me. But it started way before, before today. That interaction had happened 300 years prior, right? Another example of this would be when you're like Black. We always talk about Tuskegee when it comes to like medical mistrust around Black people, right? Tuskegee. But I mean, you got Henrietta Lacks. There is so many other examples of medical mistrust around Black people. And again, this dates back to during the slavery period in America. Why is that mistrust there? Well, I need help, but yet I still have to go to this white doctor to get help. And I don't know if he even has my best interest at heart, because my grandmama went to a doctor and they didn't take care of her. My great-grandmother went to a doctor. They didn't really take care of her too well. My great-great-grandmother went to a doctor and they didn't take care of her that well. And sometimes, and I hate giving these presentations, if there's any doctors in here, I'm sorry. The way doctors are even trained is sometimes bad, because they are trained to be, I like how nurses are trained much better than doctors. Doctors are always trained to be like the authority in the room. And unfortunately, that becomes problematic too. And we're gonna talk about that a little further in the presentation. So helping professions need to understand post-traumatic slave syndrome, because one, we don't want to do any harm to our clients, right? I have been blessed to been teaching for like 3 years. I have mentored a lot of MSW students, and I have been blessed to also like create a safety environment for my white, straight, cisgendered students, where they can come to me with like some of their questions, and I will never, and I actually wrote an essay on it, check it out at Social Workers Today, about what happens when your client is telling you, for example, if you're in a counseling session and they say, I hate white people. Because sometimes, you know, counselors don't necessarily know how to answer that. And I would have this, I told the MSW students, I said, it's not you they're hating the 246 years of chattel slavery, another 100 years of institutional racism. You just happen to just be in the room projecting that. But they don't necessarily hate you, they hate the system. But understanding that, if you do not understand that, when you work in communities of color, if I come into your office, me, and I'm saying, you know, I'm hating white people today. I'm hating white people today. And you don't know how to respond to that, you could do harm to me. I'm again really blessed to have colleagues who really are safe around with talking about issues like this. I had another student white female, she was in a counseling office. She was doing her practicum in a counseling office, and she was working with reentry with clients who were being re-entered in society, who had just been released from prison. The client, 6'5", big Black guy, comes into the room. He sees her, she sees him. She kind of tenses up a little, but she kind of relaxes, and he immediately tenses up. And she talks to me in supervision about this experience, how she literally watched this 6'5" big Black guy try to shrink himself into this space. And she just didn't understand why he would try to shrink himself in this space. And I explained to her that what's happening in that moment, in that interaction, is 246 years of slavery, oppression, and he's trying to shrink himself because he knows the history of what happens to Black men who are in the room with white females and not being accounted for or trying. So he's literally like looking like this, she said, in the room. Now, the good thing is she had the knowledge and the tools to create the environment so he knew, look, you're okay, you're in a safe space. But I often, when we were talking about that in supervision, I said, well, damn, what if she didn't have that? What if she didn't know that? And she wasn't in tune to what, and I tell students this all the time. I say, you know, I don't worry about A's and B's or C's because I know a lot of students who get A's and B's and I would not put them in a room with a warm soul ever. So if you're an MSW student or a BSW student, it's about connection and being in tune with that. So I'm gonna leave that there. So my next point is knowing when you are the elephant. If one walks into the room unaware of their privilege, similar to the story I just gave, you can do unintentional or intentional harm. And sometimes we're not even aware of the harm we're doing to folks if we're not in tune to it. So what was the impact of slavery on white people, right? So if you're looking at this picture of this lynching, you'll see there is a white adolescent male, a tall white adolescent male. And actually, if you can see the full picture, this is on Google. There are little girls, little boys. This is like a whole like shindig here, celebrating the trauma and killing and the death of someone. And I say, there's a lot happening in this picture. White people, I always say, were not socialized to empathize with the violence that happens to Black people in America. And it happened long before George Floyd, long before Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. It happened long before that. Because what is happening in this picture, like you can sit there and watch humans suffering and can smile during that, right? We talk about cognitive dissonance, disconnecting feelings, because it's hard to understand how you could look at that and think that that was okay. But we have to now, sometimes we try to but those folks try to justify that cruelty because they are not connected. And I have had white friends of mine who say, you know, I don't get it. Why don't they just do what the police say, right? And I say, well, we've seen examples of why don't they do what the police say? And this happens. But when I hear that, when white folks ask me questions like that, I know that they have not been socially conditioned to empathize or see what they are clearly seeing. And I hate doing this. I try to say, well, imagine if it was a white man, or imagine if it was a white teenager. And then sometimes they get it, but you have been socially conditioned to not empathize with Black people way before you were even born. You know, this is generational. And I tell people, in order to empathize with folks that are different than you, you may have to work on it. You may have to intentionally and actively work on how to empathize with with people who are different than you, because you have been socially conditioned not to empathize with people who are different or who are Black. Next slide. So I love this one. This is my favorite. Being white in America is a culture. So it's a culture. Being Black in America is a culture. Being Latinx in America is a culture. It is not the default for the country. And I know a lot of folks like to think that. And so one of the things I don't do as a professor is I tend not to correct how students speak. I think that's so, like, you know, if they want to use a couple ain'ts and y'alls and a few curse words, or, you know, whatever, you know, dialect they choose to use, I'm okay with that, because where they're from, maybe that's as long as they're giving me the answer, I'm really cool with that. But sometimes, and I have to do this with some folks, I'm not there to uphold white supremacy. And none of us, we all want to understand that white is not the default, the way we speak, the way we act, social conditioning, and social standards. I have a lot of intersections happening in my life. I'm Black, I'm queer, I'm older, convicted felon. Like, I have a lot of things that people would not necessarily think, wow, these are the social standards, you know, that this person should be thrown away, right? But because, you know, I've done the work of not feeling like this, like the white is the default, we are all able to heal from all of that. Sometimes this is where I feel like a lot of students and medical settings really have a hard time adjusting, because I often tell students, if a person is on the street talking to themselves, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're a danger to you. That just means they're talking to themselves, right? And you're going off the social conditioning and social standards that you've been taught that people shouldn't talk to themselves. But I want you to look at it from a different perspective, and look at it from, are they doing harm? Will I be doing harm to them if I stop them from doing whatever it is they're doing? So this is really, really important. I often tell people, because people don't look at being white as a culture, and I was like, no, it's a culture. It's a culture, and there's standards and social norms in acting, and there's Blacks who have a culture, and there's Latinx folks and Asians, and there's all kinds of cultures, and we have to embrace that and understand that. All right, I'm gonna, so oppression, there are some old ideas of oppression, maintaining negative stereotypes and ideas, such as all Black people eat chicken and can sing and dance, or and there are theories about restricted opportunities, the binary notion, there's only Black and white, right? And one of the theories that I really try to hone in on with folks, this is like old ideas, is understanding when you're the elephant in the room and understanding when you are the mouse. So I often tell the story of, there's an elephant and a mouse in a room. The elephant can live in the room its entire existence and never see the mouse, never have to worry about the mouse, and just go on about its elephant way. The mouse in the room has to always be aware of the elephant. And why is that? Why does the mouse have to be aware of the elephant? Because any misstep with that mouse, that elephant is going to smash the mouse. So a lot of us, for example, Black people are walking around as mice, navigating elephants. I am usually very surprised. I teach at Penn State, and I can't even tell you the number of times I've had students tell me I was their first Black professor. And I was like, you going your whole life without a Black teacher? Oh my God. And what does that mean? So now they're questioning, am I qualified? And I always tell them, if I'm a Black teacher, meet the preferred qualifications, not the minimum qualifications, but that's a whole nother story. But the thing is that understanding that if you are the elephant in the room, how do I make the mouse feel like an elephant too? Like, we are both on equal footing, right? So let's go back to the story I told about the young lady who had the guy who was just released in prison, he came into her office. And how she had to she knew she was the elephant in the room, and she had to then create a safe space for him to feel like an elephant in the room as well. She had to intentionally do that. Because she knows, well, now she knows that there is a history there. There's a history there that is creating that behavior for him. Next slide. So some new ideas. Theories to understand and address oppression is around social constructs. White, cisgendered, heterosexual, abled Christian males are kind of like the standard, they say, in American society, like, of course, according to the social constructs. And anything that goes below that is like, you're getting like lower and lower down the pole of social constructs. But when you understand how to use social constructs to your advantage, understanding how they work, especially if you're a person of privilege. So I'm a cisgender male. So if I meet people who are trans, I understand that, one, I'm now the elephant in the room. And two, I have to now create this safe space because I understand that I get a level of privilege that they do not get, right? Cultural and ethnic sensitivity. I kind of sometimes hate this. I usually like to use cultural and ethnic humility because everything we do has to be a learning experience. Rather you don't know or you do know, you have to, as the person in power and privilege, and just being in this webinar, right, is a privilege, right? Because there's a lot of people who might want to be in this webinar and can't. And also, you're taking the time to learn about this. So this is already putting you in that position of power and privilege. Understanding multi-levels of oppression, individual. And I think that's when people really like get it, when it's individual, when it's micro. But really what I study and what I continue to study is institutional and social cultural oppression. I worked for a couple years in the Department of Health as their lead for integrated healthcare among LGBTQ people, and it was, for lack of a word, a shit show. I'm sorry. Anybody who works at the Health Department of Philadelphia, God bless you, because the institutional and cultural insensitivity that occurred there was really just also a result of, again, post-traumatic slave syndrome. And one of the theory, I always said the framework around the Department of Health was, if these people knew better, they would already do it themselves, right? But we know that you can't necessarily do it yourself if you don't have access or you don't have the resources to do it yourself. And that was always something I struggled with working in the Department of Health is, yeah, folks will rise up to the occasion. Folks are resilient. You just have to give them the resources and the access to it. But that's around institutional and social oppression. Okay. So we rob ourselves of our own humanity when we refuse to look at the stuff. Anything that robs us of our humanity is a danger to everyone. So again, I want to take you back to the slide of the lynching, right? I always get, when I give these types of lectures, you know, it might be someone who's really uncomfortable. They're really taking it, all of this really personally. And I said, I love that, but this ain't about you, right? Sometimes it could be a white person, a white girl crying, and I'm like, look, this song ain't about you. This is about, if you're gonna go into my communities and you're gonna help, I need you to know, and I need you to understand your own humanity and what is happening with you in that discomfort. Because if you don't, you're gonna mess up somebody else. That's the point. So that quote is by Dr. Joy DeGruy, and I try to live by it. I love it. Excellent. So the empowerment approach. Now there are a lot of critiques. I didn't even know that that there were so many critiques on post-traumatic slave syndrome, but I'm going to talk about that in a couple of things. The empowerment approach is to social work practice to enable practitioners to co-investigate the realities with poor, the working poor, people of color, women, and those who are oppressed by virtue of sexual orientation, physical, mental health challenges, youth, age, and help them confront obstacles imposed by class, race, and differences. So I just want to be very clear that this post-traumatic slave syndrome does not need to be in the DSM. It does not need to be in this. We do not need to pathologize. I'm saying that all wrong. I'm sorry, my mouth is dry now. Black people, because then that's saying that there is something wrong. Really, how you address post-traumatic slave syndrome is through social justice initiatives and social justice efforts. Understanding that being Black or being a woman or being trans or being queer is a symptom of, a symptom or a sign of whatever other mental health or challenges a person may be going through. Like that could be also in the care. Like being Black could be part of the issue, the challenges that they're having. Like I'm having to deal with all of these different systems. And it's through those social justice initiatives on a institutional and social level that help on the micro level, which I think Dr. Jari is going to get into momentarily. I'm going to show, because I love showing how the theoretical perspective looks in the how it looks today, right? So I'm gonna share a video, a 2-minute video from Blackish. I don't know if they knew that they were doing this or not, but it's just a perfect example of post-traumatic slave syndrome and what it would look like if you went into the office tomorrow, okay? So I'm gonna share my screen.
And that's what truly makes America great. Horror. I can't believe you abandoned a 3-year-old.
I think she was 4.
You monster.
If you watch closely, you can actually see her tiny spirit being crushed. Faith in humanity? No faith in humanity. Faith in humanity? No faith in humanity. That is how serial killers are born.
Okay, look, I know it looks bad, but that is a little white girl. And as a Black man, no! No! You do not get to play the race card today. Not with that.
Sorry, I'm late. There was a little snowflake on the elevator, so I had to take the stairs.
Me too.
Careful, Dre. Someone's out there setting traps.
I don't understand. Why are you two so afraid of a baby? We don't have the luxury of being helpful because we're instantly seen as threats.
Well, that's just common sense.
I see any adult male as a threat. The point is, we can't get away with half the stuff that you guys do.
Look, I'm sorry I'm late, boss.
Mhm.
There's a little white girl in the elevator.
Almost had me.
I saw my freedom flash right before my eyes.
So some of my coworkers didn't get it, but I knew my family would. Mm-hmm.
I married a monster.
To be fair, as a Black man, we can never be too careful Kev, I remember my first little white girl in an elevator. Right thing, son. Proud of you.
You're proud of him?
Damn proud.
Okay, this is insane. What do you think would have happened if you'd helped the little white girl?
Your mom, okay? All right. You know what floor she's on?
So, Andre, what were your plans here today?
Okay, I get it. You had to be guarded to survive the NWA 80s. But it is Drake Summer 16. You don't have to be guarded anymore.
Whatever. All right, I'm not going to let you take this away from me. Pops is proud of you.
Damn proud.
Stop sharing. So if we have time, if anybody wants to kind of process or make a comment about the video they saw. So you see in that short clip, you know, his initial reaction is, I'm not helping her. And then, you know, he has to process why he didn't help her. And then also his other three colleagues then have to process why they didn't help her. It's so weird when I show this to students, show this video to students, and like the class is like literally sometimes divided on who would have helped and who wouldn't have helped as far as the students of color. Most of my students of color said they wouldn't help, and some students said they would, depending then on the gender. So then gender plays a role in this as well. But you see how that post-traumatic slave syndrome still speaks today, how he understands that, like, I'm not the only one entering this room. As small as that little girl was on that elevator, she was the elephant in the room. And he was the mouse, and he had to navigate that space really quickly. So if anyone wants to share a thought or ask a question about the video, if it made sense.
Thank you, Antar. I think what we'll do is we will kind of circle back to this at the end of the presentation. Thank you for doing such an amazing job. You know, really powerful. Thank you. And I'm gonna turn this over to Dr. Jari Santana-Wynn and invite, you muted yourself and everything. We're getting good at this webinar stuff. Okay, no further ado. Welcome, Jari. Please share your screen. I will mute myself.
All right, everybody should be able to see my screen now, I hope. Thank you, Antar, for that great presentation. Boy, I have big shoes to follow. Julie, Westchester University, and the EPIC team, thank you for everything you did to coordinate this. This is a great topic, so thank you for inviting me. I'm sure that everybody who is in attendance tonight has some familiarity with some of the theoretical frameworks that examine racial inequalities within our society. What distinguishes critical race theory, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, from most of these other schools of thought is that, unlike most of the earlier genres of race scholarship, critical race scholarship does not treat race as an independent variable. Rather, it regards race as a site of struggle. So, because as Justice Harry Blackmun once said, in order to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. This is what we refer to as being race conscious as opposed to colorblind, a theory that many of us have heard about and a belief system that many of us were raised in, which we'll explore a little bit more detail a bit later. Critical race theory offers a framework of analysis as it pertains to the relations of power in a racially diverse society. In this portion of the presentation, I will discuss CRT with a particular focus on the relationship to mental health care or behavioral health care. But I want to make sure that we, as we think about it, that we consider it as integrating all of the other practices in which our clients engage in the other systems in which they participate. So we'll explore how it can become a clinical tool in an ethical, anti-oppressive, and socially just practice. And this is crucial to our effort of eliminating the inequity in integrated care, because historically, the fields of medicine and psychotherapy have been infused with negative racial ideologies from their very inception. I'll give specific examples a little bit later. But moreover, institutional and structural racism within the behavioral health system in our society continue to hinder the therapeutic progress and model our clinical practice despite our best intentions as race-conscious therapists. Through the application of CRT, it is possible to challenge the Eurocentric and ethnocentric ways in which the mental health field operates. So I hope that we'll be able to get some ideas about that here. Okay, here we go. My slides were stuck. So what is critical race theory? It's a movement that originated within legal studies by way of a revolutionary movement that evolved within it, known as critical legal studies, which argues that the legal system is neither impartial nor value-free, but it is in fact inseparable from politics, requiring a set of knowledge and power processes that limit the ordinary people's access to it and its benefits. So CRT grows from that school of thought, but adds a framework for understanding the racism that is fundamental as an aspect of American culture, which drives our social political systems and thereby uphold white supremacy and perpetuate racial inequality. And since we know that individual cultures construct their social realities in their own self-interest, in the United States, this means that minorities' interests are subservient to the system's self-interest. Therefore, we can't trust the system to the existing systems, which were built by and for white elites to promote and support social and economic progress for racial minorities that threaten white supremacy. They will support efforts that do not threaten white supremacy and do not lower their position in the hierarchy, but not those that threaten their position in the hierarchy. Consequently, the ultimate goal of critical race theory is to transform the social, economic, legal, educational, and political systems that organize society along racial lines and hierarchies. This obviously indicates that, unlike some academic disciplines, but much like social work, critical race theory contains an activism dimension. And that's important to consider because that's not the case for fields like psychology. And in fact, I've often been questioned about, are you sure you're a psychologist and not a social worker? And I'm like, absolutely, but I'm a psychologist who understands critical race theory. So yeah, you go social work. So the other thing about CRT is that it is multidisciplinary. And while it originated in critical legal studies, CRT scholars propose to challenge the dominant discourse on race by moving beyond a single doctrine and adopting a multidisciplinary methodology that is also informed by Black feminist theory, radical feminism, liberalism, Marxism, postmodernism, you name it. It's looking at multiple disciplines and how it handles and addresses race and diversity within it. And it also is intersectional, which, although CRT scholars recognize that race is central, they acknowledge that there are multiple forms of power and oppression that can operate simultaneously, such as class, gender, sexuality, colonization, ability, and other forms of identity that are all dimensions of power that mutually manifest and can intersect with race and operate synergistically. And Antar talked about this a little bit as well, but one of the examples that I often give when I am presenting about identity is that identity evolves. You know, when I was born in the Dominican Republic, and when people would ask me, what are you? They certainly were not asking about my ethnic background or my race. They were asking probably about my religion, because I dressed differently because I was Pentecostal. So I would say I'm Christian. I was not Catholic like my dad's family. I was Christian. And then I moved to New York City. And in New York City, well, there's all kinds of Latinos. So when people would ask, what are you? The answer was, I'm Dominican. And then I moved out of New York City to Ohio, and they were like, well, what are you, Mexican? And I'm like, no, kind of similar Hispanic. You know, they really didn't understand Dominican. And then moving back to the East Coast, where there's more understanding of that, but also where after working with the Latino population across multiple states, I'm less identified strictly as Dominican. And when people ask me, what are you? Then I say, well, I'm Latina. And as I've gained knowledge about critical race theory, about the African diaspora, I came to understand that I'm actually an Afro-Latinx. And there's a difference for Afro-Latinx who are immigrant versus US born. So I have 2 children who are Afro-Latinx, and they're US born. So their identity is slightly different than my identity. So today, this is also why when we chose the title, we didn't just say Black Americans, when we said African Americans, because those are the ones who evolved from, who are the descendants of African slaves. So people like me, who are immigrants, did not grow up with an identity that was tied to our ancestors having been enslaved, depending on which country we come from. Yes, there were countries where that's relevant, but there's other countries where that was not something that was central to our history, and so therefore not central to my identity. And when we think about intersectionality, one story about personal experience that occurred to me, it was that when I went to my, one time when my children were little, and I was in grad school when they were born, so this is many years ago, and so you can see what I look like, and I looked much younger back then. My kids are in college now, both of them. So I walk into the pediatrician's office with my infant daughter, who's 4 months old, and my son, who is 3 years old, and he's climbing while I'm trying to get her undressed for the doctor, for the pediatrician. That day, the pediatrician that was going to be seeing her was not our usual pediatrician because he was on vacation. So it was somebody else who didn't know us. It was her first time meeting us. And when my son was climbing, she walked in right as I turned to him, and I said in a firm but not yelling voice, because I don't yell, I said, "Get down, that's dangerous." That's it, firm tone of voice. So we finish my daughter's checkup. She's doing great, everything is great. And right as I get ready to leave, she says, "I wanted to give you this pamphlet." And I take it, and when I look at it, the pamphlet is about why we don't spank. And I looked at her very confused, and I said, I don't spank. Why? Well, I mean, I know that 3-year-olds can be difficult and we can lose our patience. And I said, but I'm a grad student down the street working on my clinical psychology degree to work with children. I know that we don't spank, and I know all the strategies. In fact, I teach parenting skills strategies. But the assumption looking at me, the assumption she had just looking at me, I looked very young. My husband wasn't present, so she didn't know whether I had support. The assumption was not that this was a mother using a firm tone of voice because this is what the child responds to. This is, to her, I was losing my patience with a 3-year-old who was going to fall, and I didn't want him to get injured. So that's one of the things that's really important, because that's a microaggression, and it occurred because of the intersectionality of my identity. Had I just been there present, had she met me perhaps as a grad student, it would have been different. Had she met me, was it the fact that I was immigrant? Was it the fact that I looked young? Is it the fact that I was dark skinned? Did she assume I was a young single mom with these 2 children? So I don't know, but it left me very shaken. She got to see us again, and she fell in love with my children, and we never had that issue again. But that's an important thing to remember when we interact with clients. So CRT considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourse takes up, but it places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, context, the group's interest and the self-interest, as well as feelings and even the unconscious, which is fantastic for psychologists. We love to talk about the unconscious. So now I want to review the tenets of critical race theory. Depending on what text you read, there might be like 10 or 12. There are some that only mention a core of 5, But I've kind of summarized it to 8, and hopefully we'll be able to get through them quickly because it's a lot of content. But race is a social construct. And every time I teach about cultural competency, I make sure to discuss race and explain that it is only an anthropological invention used to justify exclusion, inequality, and violence throughout our history. Sure, there are people with common origins that share certain physical traits, such as our skin color, our physique, our hair texture. I'm a curly hair person. But these constitute only an extremely small portion of the genetic makeup. So although race is not biologically real, as evidenced by our sharing 99.9% of our genetic material with people of other races, it is socially and politically real because we assign meaning to it. And this meaning is consequently influenced our foundational beliefs, such as the humanity of people, what rights they have, and how resources are distributed throughout the history of our country. The second tenet is that racism is ordinary, not aberrational. CRT acknowledges that race still matters and that there are still deep racial divisions in America that must be overcome and healed. We are not a post-racial society. It further affirms that racism is endemic and pervasive. Although our society has only one word, racism, for a phenomenon that is much more complex and includes intentional racism, unintentional racism, unconscious racism, institutional racism, racism tinged with homophobia and sexism, racism that takes the form of indifference or coldness, and white privilege. CRT posits that race is a central component of scholarship and that despite notions of a post-racial America, white supremacy is a constitutive feature of US life. White supremacy organizes the context and content of communication between people of color and mainstream ideological apparatus such as the media, religious and educational systems, etc. And it highlighting the power and complexity of normativity of whiteness discursively and demonstrates the influence of whiteness on people in the way that whiteness is reproduced as a cultural center. What is a typical neighborhood? When you talk about like my neighborhood, when I talk about my neighborhood, what neighborhood do you imagine? If I say, oh, I'm moving to like, you know, a normal Chester County neighborhood, what do you imagine? What are you expecting? What is normal? If you walked into a, there's a great talk I actually went to for Westchester University, and I do not remember the video, but I remember this question that was asked by the presenter. If you walked into a boardroom and everybody was Black, would you think that's odd? Would you wonder what is the organization? But if you walk into a boardroom and everybody's white, we seldom are shocked by that. So what is it that we're expecting? The third tenet is that white privilege serves an important purpose. White privilege refers to a myriad of social advantages, benefits, and courtesies that come along with being a member of the dominant race. It establishes whiteness as akin to property, valuable property at that. It confers the owner positive qualities such as goodness, intelligence, innocence, you name it. And it eases the path of upward mobility through the accompanying social advantages. So you already get these social advantages because of your whiteness, and then you're also believed to have all of these positive qualities because you've actually utilized these social advantages. So thereby, it gives rise to a socioeconomic gap that suggests a racial hierarchy that actually does not really exist. The hierarchy in turn determines who gets the tangible benefits, which includes best jobs, the best schools, invitations to social events, which further serves to preserve the hierarchy by furnishing its beneficiaries with access to tools, opportunities, resources, all of the things that are necessary for us to succeed. And so an example is that, for example, when I went to Penn, I started my undergraduate career at Penn. At the end of the very first semester, people were talking about, well, what are you doing during your Christmas vacation? I'm from the Bronx. I'm going back home to spend Christmas with my family. And more than half of the people in my dorm were going to travel somewhere and we're gonna go skiing. I didn't even know how to ski. Number one, I grew up in the Caribbean. There was no such thing as skiing or ice skating or anything like that. But in New York City, there was no easy way to ski. I learned to ice skate, but so even if I had been invited to go with my classmates, that would have been an opportunity that I could not really participate in. And so again, the opportunities that we grow up with, whether or not we utilize them, whether or not that's our choice. But when we were never offered those opportunities, even things that we don't consider meaningful and necessary to our success, these are things that create space for us. It doesn't mean that every white person has access to these opportunities, but it means that the opportunities are available almost exclusively to white people, almost exclusively. So it's the difference between an escalator versus the stairs. Yeah, if you're taking the escalator, you know, I can still beat you on the stairs if I run up the stairs. But if we're gonna walk at the same pace, you're always going to beat me because there is an extra advantage that you have. And hierarchies are systems that create groups and assign status to those groups. Therefore, the highest ranked group has certain power and privilege that the lower ranked group does not. This is why CRT scholars hold that reverse racism is a myth, because the lowest ranked group may discriminate against you, but it will never, ever have the privilege to hold you down or the power to hold you down. And the fifth tenet is a critique of liberalism. Liberalism is a political philosophy that holds that the purpose of government is to maximize liberty, and as it pertains to civil rights, is the view that law should enforce formal equality in treatment. CRT's critique of liberalism stems from a discontent with the framework's approach for addressing racial problems. The movement is incremental and aims for gradual reform that is piecemeal, affording some opportunities but not others, securing some rights but not others, all of which result in the continued disparities in achievement. And here I want to show like a 20-second clip. Give me a second. Let's see.
Mother's done it. My uncle's done it. My brothers and my sisters done it. My nieces and my nephews done it. How much time do you want? All your
All
problem.
right. So that was James Baldwin. And so this is the critique of liberalism. How much time do we have to wait? Because how much time have we waited already? And we're still fighting for this. The movement, many liberals believe in colorblindness and neutral principles of constitutional law, holding that it is wrong for the law to take any note of race, even to remedy the historical wrong. But this limits our abilities to address anything but the most egregious racial harms, ones that everyone would notice and condemn. So this is something that we just saw a few months ago. Watching a man die with a knee on his neck is something that everybody's going to agree, yeah, that was wrong. But if racism is so deeply embedded in our thought processes and social structures, then our most ordinary routines, practices, and institutions are going to perpetuate the subordinate positions of racial minorities, and we're not going to notice it. Jane Elliott, I don't know how many of you are familiar with her, but she's a school teacher and a diversity educator, best known for her eye color exercise. You can Google that, it's on YouTube. And so she performs this exercise with school-age children. And she also had another exercise that she does with adults. And she says in that exercise, I want every white person in this room who would be happy to be treated as this society treats in general our Black citizens. I want you to stand up. And if you are a white person and you'd be happy to receive the same treatment that our Black citizens do, again, stand. And nobody stood up. And so she said, that says very plainly that you know what's happening and you know that you don't want it for you. I want to know why you are so willing to accept it or to allow it to happen for others. And so critical race theory very much calls us to that and demands that if we will not accept this for ourselves, that we don't accept it for others either. Therefore, it is more aggressive in race-conscious method. And it intends to affect meaningful change. It aims for these radical institutional changes rather than reformist ones that we're used to. The sixth tenet of critical race theory is storytelling as an essential device for conveying the experiences of racially oppressed people. And so this I love because I use storytelling very much as a therapist. It's very much part of the Latino culture. So yay, storytelling. In CRT, narrative and storytelling are the central methods of analysis which incorporate the voices of racial minorities in order to develop a more complete understanding of what race means and what it's like to be non-white in America. Since racial minorities have historically lacked a voice in our society, CRT then seeks to hear and amplify the voices of the marginalized. It utilizes counter stories as a vehicle to challenge the hegemonic ideologies about Black inferiority and criminality, and to disrupt the normative cultural and personal narratives that reify the marginalization of people of color and invalidate their personal experiences. And some examples actually are films. That's one of the ways that we that have been very popular. So movies like Racing in the Sun, Blind Spotting, Fruitvale Station, 12 Years a Slave is fantastic. Remember the Titans, If Beale Street Could Talk, which won some awards recently, Get Out, and more recently on Netflix there's a show, a series, Lovecraft Country, which I just learned about because one of my friends' child makes an appearance in it, so I'm excited about it. But these narratives share in common the goal of increasing our understanding of what life is like for others, so helps us develop empathy. The seventh tenet is a commitment to social justice, as stated earlier. Unlike other theoretical frameworks that examine racial disparity, CRT contains this activist dimension, and it not only tries to understand our social situation, but to change it. CRT stands in opposition to dominant ideologies and discourse, and is committed to advocate for social justice for those who are marginalized, disadvantaged, victimized as a result of the social institutions that disenfranchise them. And it is its goal to achieve a better brand of justice by eradicating racial disparities in our systems. And lastly, it is interdisciplinary. It considers this interdisciplinarity instrumental. It understands that there is a historical relationship between academia and the maintenance of white supremacy. Therefore, any efforts to eradicate racism will require that theorists move across disciplinary boundaries to connect relevant scholarships that takes up the marginalized position, so that all of the systems that contribute to the organization of our society along racial lines and hierarchies can be challenged and transformed at the same time. This means that every field of study is essential to the fight for racial justice. So it doesn't matter what kind of work you do. Every field of study has to change radically. And we can't operate in silos, because then we will miss the crucial information necessary to achieve our goal, which is why we're having this conversation, and which is why making sure that we are interdisciplinary, that we share across our different areas of expertise, mental health, physical health, social work, education, all of those, it's important that we collaborate. And I'm not going to go very much into this because Antar touched on it, but PTSS, post-traumatic slave syndrome, has received some critique, as Antar earlier said, but one of the most popular ones and well-read one from almost everybody I've talked to about this is the piece by Ibram Kendi in the online publication Black Perspectives. And in that piece, he states that it is a racist idea to think that something is wrong or dysfunctional or inferior about Black people, including any theories that root dysfunctionality in the history of oppression. And that for anti-racists, negative behaviors are what makes Black people a human group. imperfectly equal, is what he calls them, to all other imperfectly equal humans and racial groups. So, and he holds that there's nothing wrong or dysfunctional or negative about Black people as a group to think that the racial groups are equal. That's essential in order to be an anti-racist. And this is a valid critique because throughout history, psychology it has been used as an instrumental way of framing the discourse on the defining differences of race to promote ideas of an enduring racial hierarchy. And as early as 1851, scientific racism influenced the field of behavioral healthcare and supported the systems of oppression of Black people through the identification of something called drapetomania, which is a term that became a credible mental health condition used to describe the drive of African slaves to try to flee slavery. So here we are. The field was actually identifying something that should be healthy as something that is unhealthy. And in the book, Even the Rat Was White, a historical view of psychology, Dr. Robert Guthrie exposed a long history of racist work. It's a fantastic read if you're interested. But it talks about the racist history of psychology and how it was used to legitimize the oppression of African Americans and promote ideas of Black inferiority, such as the well-known book, The Bell Curve, which suggested racial differences in IQ and intelligence between races. And although there was a partial retreat from scientific racism following the intense critique that it received in the 1930s after World War II, the civil rights movement seemed to revive it. And so there was back, all these claims about Black intelligence, the brain size, morality, criminality, sexuality. I'm sure you've heard it. And they were used in popular campaigns aimed to eliminate government programs and promote racial separation and increase immigration restrictions. Does that sound familiar? So although the harm that psychological community has caused to racial minorities has not been adequately addressed, mental health practitioners continue to try to help Black people survive psychically in a world that is trying daily to strip them of their humanity. And it is important to point out that Professor Kendi readily acknowledges that African American people have been and continue to be damaged physically, economically, politically, and socially by white racism and the legacy of slavery. And so here lies the vital importance of interdisciplinarity, because whereas Professor Kendi, who's a historian, considers a racist idea to be one that assumes Black inferiority, and an anti-racist idea one that asserts Black equality, Professor DeGroot, who is a clinical psychologist and a social work researcher, considers a racist idea one that harms Black and white people, as Antar explained to us earlier, and an anti-racist idea one that heals Black and white people. And so as practitioners, if we're cognizant of that trauma and inferiority in culture, and we're aware that those three things are separate things and should not be conflated, then we can help our African American clients acknowledge their trauma without this acknowledgement branding them as inferior. Nevertheless, desegregating trauma from culture in the hopes that white America will stop equating the two and understands that it doesn't imply inferiority, only casualty, is not enough, because when PTSS falls into the hands of white people looking for confirmation of their racist beliefs, they will look upon African American people as a group that is dysfunctional and damaged or culturally inferior. So in our fight to improving the bodily and economic health of African Americans, we must also battle against the stigma of mental health in our society. That a person is not their diagnosis and that illness is culturally defined. That having been victimized doesn't mean that the individual's agency is limited. They're still able to act on their own best interests. That counterproductive behaviors that they develop to cope with harm inflicted upon them doesn't make anyone inferior or non-human. To the contrary, it points to our humanness. And that the only possible response to traumatic experiences is not dysfunction or failure. Historical trauma experienced by African American people does not preclude successful lives. So the opportunities that have been denied to African American people, and which are illustrative of the oppression, which includes access to the same services and quality of care as their white counterparts, include poverty, which results from limited educational and economic opportunities. And we know that this leads to food insecurity. And research has shown us that our diets influence and affect the way that our brains develop. And these things can affect attention and decision-making and learning and our response to stress. This is supported by studies on epigenetics and the ACEs studies, which indicate that intergenerational trauma can interfere with an individual's ability to function and can negatively affect health outcomes, including life expectancy. So PTSS is not a disorder that can simply be treated and remedied clinically, but rather also requires profound social change in the individuals as well as the institutions that continue to reify inequality and injustice towards the descendants of enslaved Africans. We must challenge the cultural deficit models that are presented to us. So this brings us to racial healing. Nevertheless, healing from trauma and being free from traumatization are not mutually exclusive. So we can begin the process of racial healing while working to eradicate the systems that uphold white supremacy. We don't have to wait to try to help our clients until we have fixed everything. And how do we initiate this process? Racial healing is a process or a tool to facilitate trust and build authentic relationships that bridges the divides by real and perceived differences. It starts by listening, by becoming open to one's own perspectives and experiences, and one another's perspectives and experiences, allowing yourself to be impacted or transformed by those experiences. And working on anti-racism, acknowledging that unconscious bias lives in us and lives through us. Confronting white fragility, in which, again, back to what Antar said, this is not about creating white guilt, or triggering white guilt. That's not our intention. Our intention is to give you the tools that you need in order to go out there and challenge the systems that are perpetuating these inequalities and this oppression. So please know that empathy is not enough. You have to get out there and do the work. You have to be a voice and you have to create space for others. We have to acknowledge the harms of the past through people's stories. We talked about the role of CRT and the role of storytelling in CRT, and reaffirm the humanity in all of us. Affirmation and acknowledgement is important for clinicians because we need to convey a general understanding and acceptance of the premise that race is a critical organizing principle in societies. Our clients need to know that we know that we're not going to challenge them on that. We need to validate their experiences of race. And this is different from affirmation and acknowledgement in that it goes beyond just conveying that we know about race and to validation that provides confirmation of their worldview, their experiences of being stereotyped and pathologized and criminalized and suffering due to their painful experiences of racism and microaggressions that they face daily. When I have a client that tells me I was misdiagnosed, I'm going to hear their story and not just assume that they're just here, pill shopping or whatever it is. Like, I want to hear their experience. Talk to me about what this is like. And I can tell you that as a practitioner, I have witnessed other practitioners react to a client who was upset, angry, yelling perhaps, with an extreme level of fear that to me I couldn't understand, because I had witnessed other clients that were white behave in even more intense and severe ways that and the practitioner was able to handle it. So this was very eye-opening for me the first time that it happened. And then the other piece is the process of naming. We have to name and challenge. There's a challenge in trying to heal from something that we cannot name. So it is difficult if it's difficult to describe or quantify or codify, then our experience with it and how it impacts us, it becomes vague. And therefore, naming racial oppression for our clients when they share racially based experiences is a way of providing them with a common language that conveys what is happening to them. And this offers an external and consensual validation that helps to restore their voice. So now to improving access to services. The DSM-5 contains an entire section that contains tools and techniques to enhance the understanding of the cultural context of mental disorders. And so this is a work in progress. This is not by any means all-encompassing, but this is a place to start. It includes a cultural formulation framework for assessing information about cultural features of an individual's mental health problems, and also how it relates to a social and cultural context. And it has an interview, which has, I think, about 16 questions to obtain information during a mental health assessment about the impact of culture on key aspects of an individual's clinical presentation and care. It is important that we are careful not to label or pathologize Blackness when we are diagnosing. Do not diagnose the victim. Also essential is to actively examine our own unconscious biases and racist practices. I often recommend the use of the worldview exercise, which is really good about considering the intersectionality of our identities. And it's important to retake it over the course of your career because our identities, again, change. As I mentioned earlier, you know, you might become a parent, you might become an orphan, you will age, you might join a certain religious organizations or, you know, political organizations. So all of this will influence how you identify yourself, but also how you interact with others who are same and who are different. There are the implicit association tests. There's all kinds of them out there. And it's important that we question, what are my beliefs and assumptions about my client? As Antar was mentioning earlier, when you walk into the room, how does that influence my behavior? And to be aware of the potential harm that we can cause when we are not conscious. And it's important to also to, as far as clinical practice, be aware of our role, the client-therapist relationship, and the way that we interact with the client. Who are you in the room? What is the role of the patient? And how does culture dictate the role of the patient? Think about how likely it is, if you are of a different race or of the dominant race, for a Black client to challenge you versus, and how are they going to instead probably just not return to an appointment if they felt that they were not safe to challenge you or disagree with you. So I often try to present myself as the humble expert, meaning I'm an expert in development and mental health, but you are the expert in you and your life experiences. So I want to hear from you as to what that looks like. Be willing to explore the meanings of race and racism. Create a space for race, but don't demand that your client share all of their racial trauma with you until they feel safe. Convey a sense of openness and curiosity. And invite storytelling about their racial experiences. This enables them to develop, again, their own voice and think critically about their experiences of being a racial minority. They might develop a better understanding of their own lives as they are affected by race and exposure. And externalize the problem. Make sure that they understand that this is not, the problem is external and that they're just reacting to it. And lastly, what are the steps towards improving access to services, organizational practices that we can, for those of us who are in administrative positions or in education, it's important to adopt race-conscious measures in employment and training. So expand your recruitment efforts. Share job listings in Black professional communities, such as Facebook groups for Black clinicians and listservs for historically Black colleges and universities. Improve the retention of your staff by meeting the requests as best as you can of what they need, and share when they communicate their needs to what do they need, you know, like, you have to ask them, what do you need in order to continue to work here? Also, you need to understand how racial hierarchies affect the members of your organization. One example is gentrification. Chester County is an expensive county to live in, and it's huge. So who lives closer to work because of gentrification? And offer flexible schedules so people can get to and from, to get their kids to leave Philadelphia during non-rush hour or whatever. And also consider how the different positions place unbalanced demands on African-American staff. If all your African-American staff are caseworkers, think about the demands of those positions versus the demands of your administrative staff. And understand that even though the position, those are the demands of the position and those are the requirements of the position, if the burden is falling on your African-American staff, then you have to make sure that you create support systems for them. Create time for organizational change. So listen to the racial, to the marginalized voices of your clients and your staff and offer them trainings and ensure that they are represented across in leadership positions by providing pathways for them to move through upper management. So make sure that you participate as an agency in social justice efforts so that they feel that you have their best interests at heart. That is all I have for you, and I will kick it back to Julie and we'll take some questions.
Thank you, Jari. And really, thank you, Jari and Antar, for, we're just so truly grateful for the emotional labor that you put into these presentations and your generosity and vulnerability in sharing some of your own personal stories. It really, really made your presentations incredibly powerful. So what we're going to switch to right now is our Q&A. So I am going to ask Fatima to step in to ask some questions that have been observed in the Q&A. We've shut off the chat for the moment, and any other questions should go right into the Q&A box right now. So Fatima, if you want to join us, we'd love to hear what folks' questions are for Antar and for Jari.
Okay, so the first question is, do you believe that post-traumatic slave syndrome should be included in the DSM-5? Why or why not?
Antar, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yeah, and I mentioned this in my presentation. No, I don't think it should be included in the DSM-5 because it's not something that in which you can help an individual on. It's more of a social justice issue. So it's not something that can be treated or pathologized like Jari had mentioned earlier.
Okay, so the next question is, are you saying that culture is defined by race?
No. Was that for me? That might not.
Yes.
Okay. No, culture is not defined by race, but it is one of the factors. It's a variable that was set by folks long before any of us. So the thing is that, so if someone says, Antar, you sound like a white woman on the phone, and I've gotten that plenty of times, I know exactly what they're talking about. I know exactly what they're saying. They're saying, you're using maybe like the Queen's English, or like your voice has a really high tone to it. Or someone says, oh, you sound like you're from a certain part of Philadelphia or something like that, or you sound like you're from the Bronx or Brooklyn. That's a culture. But what I'm saying also is not making white the default culture. Like, you sound good because you sound this way, or you sound bad because you sound that way. So I hope that's more of a yes or no answer. I hope I answered that question.
Okay, Jari, this question is for you. Can you identify any culture which has given up power voluntarily or advantage? What does that mean for critical race theory?
No, I cannot, and neither have any historians that I've read. So actually, again, that absolutely speaks to critical race theory and why and how we originated, because critical legal studies was actually a challenge of the law, stating exactly that we can never critique ourselves. We can never, the dominant structures were set up so that law protects those who set up the structure. And so it will always do that. And it will always leave out the people whose voices were not present when we set up this structure. And the same thing with critical race theory. Critical race theory is saying the people who set up the system will never understand or accept that it's broken. It's going to have to be a battle from the people who can see that it is broken and who experience the consequences of this brokenness, of that, that will have to take up the fight. And that's why it cannot happen progressively. It has to happen radically. And that's the challenge. I mean, radical change, it causes pain. It's painful. You know, the whole ripping the Band-Aid off, it hurts. You know, the question is, how long does it have to hurt for? And what does that battle look like? You know, are we talking another civil war? I don't know. Are we talking a civil rights movement? I don't know. Like, what is it that it looks like? If we look at the, you know, those of us who are scholars would like to keep it within our, you know, educational systems, and maybe just make sure that we teach the next generation to do better. But is that going to be sufficient? We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's another one for you. How does in-group and out-group identification theory fit into racism being ordinary, not aberrational?
So it's true that in-group and out-group is a thing. We know that. Yes, we identify with members of our group and we have a more positive identification with that. When I took the automatic bias test for, what was it for? For children. It was for children. And so which children did I see more positive? I had a slight bias towards Black children. Well, of course, I have two of them that I love dearly. So yes, they are beautiful to me. It was a slight bias. It's important for me to know that I am going to behave differently towards Black children. And so that's important. However, does not mean that racism needs to exist, in the sense of, just because I have a slight bias did not mean that I saw white children negatively. It just meant that I saw my two as a little bit more positive. So we don't, and it doesn't mean that I would want to oppress white children or deny them access to the same thing I believe my children should have access to. So racism, it's simply a way of controlling the access to the benefits of a society by creating a hierarchy of who's better and who's worse.
Thank you, Jari. I'm so sorry, but I think we're going to have to wrap up our question and answer right